videos.
Good morning. This workshop, as I just mentioned, I gave at a pastors and leaders conference, but it's really birthed out of a passion of mine, which is to help people kind of figure out spirituality that works for them and make sense of how they think about things. And in many cases, to normalize probably what you already have intuitively going on. Sometimes it's giving language or helping you know that that thing that you think is a thing. You're not the only person who thinks that. So many of you will know that I grew up in the Friends tradition, kind of the evangelical Friends church. And so a lot of my spirituality and growing up years was based in that particular context. But as I grew older and began to be around, probably like many of you, around other people from other churches or other denominations, you realize that, hey, they sing different songs than we do, or they pray a little bit differently than we do. And I think that was one of the important parts in my journey of realizing that, kind of broadening my understanding of spirituality and then working in different contexts and in different countries, amongst different cultures, even different religions. Again, kind of helped me continue to broaden not just what I understood in my mind, because I think theologically I had room for all of that stuff, but it was being around other actual people who believed and practiced different ways that seemed really significant to me. But that also includes people inside and outside of the church. I remember particularly a formative book I read many, many years ago by Semir Salvinovich. Now I'll forget the title of it, but it's essentially he's reflecting on his own identity, Christian, atheist, Muslim, something. It's like 4 words, and his whole thing about how all of those could coexist within one person, and it really just kind of helped me see that. And working with people and knowing people like many of you would know, and who are, people who are very spiritual or seem to exhibit Christ-likeness, and they're not even part of a church or not part of a Christian church. And so how do we deal with that? So they're kind of the reality, I guess, of things, and realizing that there really is this plethora of spiritualities. And as I'll say a little bit later too, I think that's something that God builds into us and creates in us. So kind of like Lynn reflected on this morning, from Janice's quote, that there is these innate, these in us things that God has built and created. And oftentimes it's how do we find a way for it to come out or come to life? So those are some of the things that have kind of shaped my own understanding and practice of spirituality. But I find that this topic is, most people find that's really nice, that's sort of interesting, but that's really kind of a fringe thing. I really don't have time for this. You can ask Margie. For many years, I worked in spiritual direction and kind of helping people with this sort of thing. And I could never get work because no one could afford it, because they're like, well, I cannot pay for, some kind of bonus Christianity type stuff. So, but I would think now, kind of giving the realities of our world, that it sort of seems like everybody's like, well, nothing seems to kind of work anymore. Nothing that used to worked anymore. And that's kind of where we're going to start this morning. So I hope that maybe now this becomes a conversation that people are a lot more interested in, at least you all are. So that's helpful, if nothing else. So I wanted to now stop talking for a second and make you think for a second, and potentially even say something aloud for a moment. Because I want you to think, each one of you to think of, did I write this down? Oh yeah. Think of 3 things. Think of 3 significant things that have changed in your life in the past year. So those could be positive or negative. They don't have to be just negative. Just the past year. And maybe as you think of one, depending on the situation, I would love if people would just say one of those out loud, if not all 3. Anybody have some things that have changed in their life in the past year? Retired from work. Is that in the past year? Close enough. Wow, that's awesome. I think it's significant either way. Other significant things from the past year. Change churches, I guess, to this one. Thank you. Yeah. Moved to a new state. Gained a hearing aid. I know there's many of us who have had births, that have had deaths, moves. We mentioned moves. Change of jobs, loss of jobs, gains of jobs, health things. Yeah, a lot of things have changed in most of our lives, in many of our lives. And it's probably too soon to make sense of a lot of those things. A lot of those are still kind of happening. I guess sort of like we talk about the pandemic, like it's we don't really know what's gonna come from it because we're still in it, right? So we have changed. I guess that's my point, right? We have changed. Now, people always change. I think most of us know this. We grow, we develop, our interests change, our knowledge changes, our tastes differ over the course of our lives, how we spend our time, what we find is important. Okay, so that's not revolutionary that we as people change. So my question to us, maybe rhetorically, is do we ever think about our spiritual life changing over time? Some of us are maybe more aware or conscious of that. Maybe some of us just kind of causes us to think for a second. Most of the time we realize it's changed when something happens different, right? We're not conscious of the changes that's happening. So lots of change. And when things get hard or we're feeling dry, if you want to use that kind of language, we will often go back to things that we've done in the past. That's pretty normal, right? Like, well, I used to always do this, and that was really helpful. And sometimes it's good to return to what has worked. But I think for most of us, we've changed. So we're not the same person that thing worked for 20 years ago. I don't know if we ever think about it that way, like, well, it worked for me 20 years ago. Well, that wasn't the person that I am now. So how does that work or not work for me? But we expect the same results. So my point in all this is just to say, I want us to be aware and conscious of the fact that we are changing people. It's really important to this whole thing. And has our spiritual life changed with us? Okay, but as I said, we all change, right? I think we acknowledge that all people change over time. What's different is we're used to, most of us, I suppose, are used to being people who can change and grow and develop within a relatively stable world. So we have this capacity to change and grow because the things around us are going to stay stable to allow us this room to move. But I think we can all kind of relate to the fact that we don't live in a fixed system world anymore. Like the whole world seems to be a little bit out of control. And so here we're changing in the middle of a changing world. And that's part of what makes us feel a little bit lost. I don't think I have to spend a long time talking about how drastically the world has changed. I think pretty much I can say that and we move on. We've had are in the middle of and have experienced this global pandemic. People have felt separated. We felt unsafe. We've been at odds about how to respond. Basically, our life has been disrupted. And I think there's a term that we use that's used, I suppose, in academia, although you probably are familiar with it, this idea of liminality or a liminal time and space. And that's a place of drastic change. It's like a crossing from one thing to another. And we're kind of in, it seems like, a moment like that, but we don't know where it's going. So we just know we're in the middle of this giant change time. So in the past, we've operated largely in sort of a, boundaried, dualistic, binary type worldview, where things are one way or the other. But now, we've lost some of the separations that were part of our normal society. Like, there's not a separation between work and home for most people anymore. Like, I mean, there's always been people that worked from home, but that's like now just kind of everybody works at home, from home, sometimes at home. So I think many of us have experienced it like, well, when am I home and when am I at work? And so I know that's not an easy thing, right? Or weekdays versus the weekend. This is one that I thought about recently. Like, what is the difference really? Like you can be gone in the middle of the week. You can be home during the week. Like you're not working necessarily Monday to Friday and then off on Saturday and Sunday. It's not like that for most people anymore. Now it's been a pretty normal boundary for a long time. Or even like online versus in-person relationships. So I know this probably is a generational thing that I will say here, but I have younger people in my life, children, I should say, and a wife who's younger. But and in all of those cases, in our case, so I think many of us, I know because I've talked with you, would say like my most important and real relationships are ones that I can have in person, where I can sit down with somebody and have a conversation or watch a movie or whatever it is that we do. For a lot of other people, that's not a given anymore. I think that's really hard for us to understand. Well, that's not a real friendship. That's not a real relationship. You don't really know that person. But there's people that spend a lot longer talking to a person online than I will talk to a person in person. So maybe they do have a significant relationship. Like that one really breaks my paradigm. They talk about this great resignation. You're familiar with this term probably. Basically, everyone is leaving, or many people are leaving jobs, just changing, ending, stopping. They can't hire enough people for most places, it seems like these days. Church attendance worldwide has gone down. Volunteerism, church, but outside of church as well, drastically down. I know so many people that work for nonprofits that cannot get anyone to help with anything. And gone are the days when people feel the need for a church or a pastor to be the ones to give them spiritual input or practices. So books and websites and apps are, for many people, legitimate places for their spiritual engagement. I have a son who watches YouTube videos on mindfulness rather than come to church. So I think, anyway, we're just kind of seeing those are some of those shifts, right? It's like, I use this picture. It was not long after the Winter Olympics when I gave this presentation. So it's sort of like our spirituality or our spiritual practices or spiritual life. It's like we have a pair of ice skates, but we're running a marathon. And the ice skates don't fit either. That's kind of how it feels for most of us. Like the tools that I have don't work, and they're not even the right tools for what I'm trying to do, which I think is a hard thing for us in the church business to know that people are like, that isn't even where I would go for spirituality. And the things that you do aren't even the kinds of things that I think of when I think of spirituality. That's how it is for a great many people, including some of us here. So is it any wonder that we can't use any of these one-size-fits-all programs? I would say that any approach to spirituality that assumes that we all have the same starting point or way of operating or assumptions about God doesn't work, because we're not all in those same places. We don't have the same assumptions about almost anything. But the encouraging part for me is that God, I think, doesn't use one-size-fits-all programs with us. So we don't have to either. So that to me is the encouragement in it. I would say too that kind of a binary, dualistic, cookie-cutter spirituality is a disconnected spirituality. It actually has to be, because by definition, it has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with me. It's something that's stamped onto us, which is kind of our problem with, I think, our traditional understanding about this, which is what we're going to talk about this morning a little bit more. I would say this too. Don't feel, I mean, I'm not pointing any finger, I'm pointing at myself. We're not broken. Like, it's not our fault that spirituality doesn't seem to be working. This is really important. It's sort of like, because we've got ice skates to run a marathon. Like, it's okay. Like, let's just figure out what would be better. We need this different way of approaching things. And what might be a more resilient approach, I think a vibrant approach, and what that might look like. So before we get into specifics, oh, right, yeah, I'll take off the slide. I want us to ask, so here's another interactive moment. So think again. If you were to describe living the spiritual life, or spirituality, or faith even, and you were going to use a picture for that. So I love that we have pictures here. And Lynn is so good at using pictures in his sermon this morning. What would you compare the spiritual life to? In other words, a healthy spiritual life is like what? What maybe is a picture you found to be a helpful description as you think about it for yourself? You can use Bible metaphors. Yes. Is that you, Dolores? Yeah. Like a tree. How is it like a tree? Yeah. Very good. Yeah. Nice. So it has roots, a trunk, branches, sometimes bears fruit. Sometimes you have to climb it. That's very good. Grows in the soil. Yeah, a tree of life. Yep. Nice. So interconnectedness, growth, a tree, organic. Okay. And those symbols. That's a good one. Like a lake. Oh. That's good. Joe, I'm going to say it into the microphone, so in case anybody's at home. But so it's like a lake. No, it's like a lake where there's different levels. You can see marks of where it's been. Sometimes there's like a dock or a boat, and you can kind of see how it's been. It sometimes needs new input, water or a rain or a stream or something. Yeah, those are good. Any others? Maybe one other picture? I've got a whole bunch written down. But these are good. These are actually really good. One that I think most of us think of, I got this idea from a theologian and missionary, David Bosch, and he kind of talks about this idea of a rechargeable battery. So a lot of people think of their spiritual life like a rechargeable battery. We do something, often it's like go to church on Sunday to charge up our battery. And then during the rest of the week, it just kind of is running slowly down until we can recharge it again. And then it runs slowly down. I think a lot of people, that's kind of how we operate or talk about that. I really like that. I really like jazz. Bill Braun knows this about me. I really like jazz. I like the idea of musicians who all know parts, but then they're kind of improvising, but they're improvising together, you know, and like, so you have to know what you're doing to do it. But it's not as set, you know, it's sort of like a basic part we're agreed to. And then within that, we're gonna play. I like that idea. I mean, it was the vine and the branches, like the tree idea. I think Lynn talked about this morning, so that's kind of in our heads. Or another one that I really like is the idea of taking it one day at a time, which, as we know, you know, is sort of the model from a lot of recovery programs, right? It's just one day at a time. This is my goal, is what's ahead of me today, and then we'll start again tomorrow. It's a really difficult way to live, but it's a very beautiful way and freeing way to live as possible. So I think these are all really helpful. And how we picture the spiritual life governs how we approach spiritual life. So if we think it's like a tree or a lake or jazz, that affects how we think about how it should look. and how it should be and how we should experience it. So my proposal to us this morning isn't that there's a technique for a solution. There's not a method or model to do. People always hate when I get to this part. That's why I came to this workshop. But I want us to be free from this guilt that we're not doing enough of the right steps and model. And if I just push on hard enough and do enough things, it'll be better. Again, I'm not for the cookie cutter approach. Because I think in a world so full of change, techniques and models really fall. But what we need, in my opinion, is a shift in perspective. Okay, so we have to step back a little bit. This perspective is sort of a bigger picture thing. But I think it's a simple thing, which is, I am so horrible at making PowerPoints. So I would propose that there's really kind of these three main questions that we need to each think about for our own spirituality. Who is God? Who am I? And what is my reality? And then a connected spirituality, a workable spirituality, if you will, or an everyday spirituality, sits at the center. So I couldn't really do this because I don't know how to do PowerPoints, but it's a Venn diagram and it's where they all crisscross each other. That part, I just put a triangle, but you get the idea. That's the spot. And you have to address each one of these. And one other thing that I'll mention later, because I didn't know how to put it onto the picture, in order to find something that works for you. So for the sake of time, I'm going to leave the who is God part alone. For the sake of argument, I'll just believe you have some sort of, there is a God. I'll leave it at that for you. And that you have some intention of interacting with God. Okay, so those are like kind of basics. There's other things you probably believe about God that I believe about God. But importantly, how one understands God shapes our expectation, right? So if you think, oh, well, there's a God, but God doesn't really talk, then you're not going to expect to hear from God. And if you believe God talks to everybody every day, you'll expect to hear God every day. Okay, so I'm just saying how you understand God shapes your spirituality. Other parts are what I want to talk about. The who am I? So I think this is my favorite part. So how many of us are aware, have words for our unique spirituality? I mean, you could put your hand up, but you have to. It's rhetorical. In other words, what makes you feel most connected to God? So maybe another question that's more specific, is like, how do you like to pray? Okay, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. One of the places. Or when do you feel most spiritually alive? Most of us, many, I should say, have only experienced certain types of spirituality, generally the ones that our churches are like, right? That's our experience, or our denomination, or our culture. But I would imagine that there's people here who have taken on or learned about or tried spiritual practices from another tradition. Anybody? You could just put your hand up. I'm sure there are. Yeah, because we learn and we're like, oh, that's interesting. Always likes. Oh man, someone always talks about how much they like the singing bowl. Who says that all the time, Joe? Sorry. Someone I talked to this week. Someone that both Joe and I talked to this week always mentions this. It's not that important, but that's not from like necessarily our own tradition, but we're like, that's really cool and helpful. We can use that as part of what we do in worship. So like, I think I love that. So this idea of how would you describe your spirituality? Yeah, this slide was from something else, so I will tell you what it is. So this is basically from a particular book that I like to use called "What is Your God Language?" So kind of taking the idea of love languages and saying, you've got love languages and you've got God languages. And these are just the names of the different ways, labels to talk about how people connect with God. So intellectually, the activist, caregiver, enthusiast, contemplative, naturalist, sensate, traditionalist, and ascetic. Okay, so that's just one model. Okay, you get the idea. This kind of builds on Gary Thomas's work in Sacred Pathways. So this idea that there are just various paths that we have of spirituality, of connecting with God. That's one paradigm of understanding it. There's others. Anyone have like those kinds of things? Like I've used a lot of Renovare stuff because I grew up in the French church. We only have one writer, well, one or two, Richard Foster in particular, who does a lot of work around spirituality. And so basically anything that he's written, I've had to read. And but he talks a lot about different sorts of practices and how they fit for different types of people. Or some people find like the Enneagram and the spiritual components of the Enneagram to be a helpful way of saying, yeah, that's kind of like how I am. Any other kind of like of those models that you find helpful that describe types of spirituality? Okay, different colored medicine wheel. That's a really good example. Do you want to say more about that, Warren? I mean, you don't have to. But Okay.
Understand the medicine wheel and all of its, and I don't fully all the dimensions and its uses in all kinds of ways. But when you talk about in a changing world where not everything's uncertain, it's a good way to center yourself. And that the change that is part of life, accepting that and being aware that life is constantly changing, but there is a center.
Good. Now it's like I want to talk more about that, but yeah, I think, but the point being, right, there's just different ways of saying there's different kinds of spirituality, whichever labels you want to use, whatever. This is one that I like, and I can tell you more about that another time. But my point is, kind of a workable everyday spirituality has to take account of who you are. Like this is my main point in this part. No one else lives your spirituality. And it's no use comparing ourselves to somebody else because they're not us. So what works for them and what's helpful for them isn't what's going to be necessarily the best for us. We all accept that people have different tastes in music or food preferences or personalities. So why, if we're all made in God's image uniquely, wouldn't we have unique ways of connecting with God? Like, I don't know, it makes sense to me, partly because I think we don't understand this, or we don't know this, or we've never heard this, or we've never experienced other kinds of things to know that that's really a good or helpful thing for us. We don't have a perspective on it in this kind of area. And I would say too, that every one of us is aware painfully of our limitations, right? Oh man, but I can't do this. But I think there's also some opportunities because of who you and I are uniquely made to be. So I want to offer that as an encouragement. The more you know about yourself and how you connect with God, the more you can connect with God. And then the last part of these three things is, what is my reality? Oh yeah, back to that. What is my reality? Okay, our lives change. This is the lives around us, the worlds in which we live, not just the big world in which we live, but the small world in which we live. Like we graduate, or we move, or we start a job, or we have a family, or we lose a family. Those are all in our kind of our own little realities that change. And so the better we understand our realities, the better we can have a workable everyday spirituality. I find that a lot of people, this is one that we don't take into account very much. So I give the example often of a parent who perhaps is used to praying, whatever they do. They pray in the morning every day. And then they have a baby. And suddenly they don't get to do what they want every morning. And then they, and you're like, we don't adjust because we're like, well, I guess I'm not going to pray anymore. And that's actually how most of us are, because we haven't thought through like, okay, but how do I pray given my change in circumstance? Okay, so I use that as kind of a tongue-in-cheek example, but I think it's true for all of us that all these parts of our lives are moving around and we don't adjust our spirituality because we don't think about it. So I want us to think about it and not feel guilty about it. Like, don't feel bad. Like, those changes are often good. So most of us blame our situation, as I say this, many of us blame our situation for our lack of spiritual life. Like, if I just had more time, or if I didn't have to do this, those are true. We're aware of our limitations. They are real, but they're also possibilities. So I point to people like Brother Lawrence, who talks about his spirituality while washing dishes. Like, for me, I'd be like, I don't have time for praying because I have to wash dishes. Brother Lawrence saying, I will pray while I wash dishes. Or Mother Teresa, who talks not about gearing up her spiritual battery to go then be amongst the poor, but experiences Christ as she is amongst the poor. It's seeing appointments and conversations as opportunities, not distractions from what we really want to do. So I guess I would say it's not so much about the amount of time we have, but the type of time that we have and how we use it. And to accommodate for the difference rather than letting it be a disqualifier for us. So there's overwhelming evidence, and probably your experience bears this out, that in these kind of liminal times that we live in, there's also tremendous opportunity for change. This is my hope for us as a church and for the forward. So I like questions like, how can I live my spirituality given my time this week? How can I do it given the reality? Or where will I be? Or who will I see this week? Kind of classic, where is God at work? Where do I see God at work? How can I interact with God as I go? These are all spiritual direction questions, really, but I think they're really helpful. So an everyday spirituality has to take into account our present reality. I use this example, but I had a spiritual director many years ago who challenged me when I was talking about how things weren't working. He basically said, you think the world is a machine. And if you just put in the right thing will always come out. And he said, the world's not a machine. There's too many variables. There's too many other things going into the machine that you're not aware of. There's too many processes and pieces, if you will. It's an organic thing. I like those pictures we used earlier much more than this. So with this diagram, can you see why all three are important to consider? I mean, if we want to try to work out some kind of spiritual life that doesn't take into account our reality, we're forever going to be kicking ourselves because we didn't get to whatever because we couldn't. And if we try to work out a spirituality that doesn't take into account who we are, we're forever comparing ourselves to someone else and wondering why we don't like praying this way. Is there something wrong with me? Is something wrong with prayer? I mean, I guess you could also say if we try to work out a spirituality that doesn't engage God, we're probably going to be limited in our possibilities because it's basically just here's me and here's my life and there's no God in it. So I can't and wouldn't advocate for that. The thing that I can't show in this diagram, of course, this is a flat static picture, right? They're just circles, two-dimensional. But really, every one of these circles, at least two of them, but maybe all three are dynamic. So they need to be turning, spinning, and interacting with each other, right? So like, who am I is moving, and my reality is moving. Who is God and who do I experience God to be is moving. So we're actually sitting in the middle of three kind of spinning circles. I'm not a scientist, so it's really hard for me to try to put words around this idea, but I think it's true. I think it's really important to know that, both to give ourselves grace and to kind of see, like, am I picturing myself sort of in the middle of this thing? And then the other part, I mentioned that there's one more thing. Oh, good. Yeah. I pictured there's one more thing, which is probably the most controversial thing I will say this morning, which isn't very controversial, is that we are meant to live out our unique spirituality with others. So I think this is more unpopular than maybe the other things that I've said before, because in our kind of individualistic Western world, kind of just keep to yourself, do your thing, figure it out for you. That's pretty much how we operate. But what is missing is what I believe is one of the strengths of our faith tradition and most faith traditions, which is one another. I don't know how to draw that on my diagram, so I just put it around. Of course, we're individually responsible for living our own lives, but we don't have to do it by ourselves. I think this thing about the pandemic that's been so disturbing for most of us is we're all going through a shared experience alone. Like, we're all in the pandemic, but I'm not connecting with you. Or we've had to find ways because we didn't know what to do. And what I loved this morning, and Lynn mentioned this, and I jotted down these things. There's a couple that there are things like the writing group and the Lectio Divina time and the coffee groups and the deep sharing groups and the book discussion groups. Those are all examples of living a spirituality that's helpful to us, but with others. Like, there's a reason why someone goes to the book club and I don't go to the book club, because that's not the place where I'm learning and growing and connecting with God. But I go and I do this thing with these people. And I just love that, like, there's this room, there is some room, and I think we're continuing to find new ways to say, okay, how can we get other people together with you for this thing, whatever this thing is, the prayer labyrinth, worship practice, like whatever the things are. So they're all living spirituality that's helpful to us, but with others. So, next slide. So thinking back to the ways, so maybe let's think back to those. Remember, we talked earlier about how do we picture the spiritual life? How do those fit with these ideas? So we had the tree and the water, the tree, what else? Jazz. Where do we see God, myself, our reality, and others in those? Or how might we see them in those pictures? Should we take the tree? That's a nice one. Lynn talked about it. So with a tree, what's the role of God in the tree metaphor, if you will? It's providing the nourishment, right? It's doing the light and the water and all that kind of stuff that trees, whatever that is that they need. There is the tree. So like, the tree is important in the story. That's the myself part. There's the reality. So I would say that's the things like the soil, right? It's the birds that are coming around, or bees, or whatever, depending on what kind of tree it is. And then the others. This is my favorite part. So I think, I'm not a gardener, but I'm pretty sure a lot of growy things do better around other growy things, right? Because they need cross-pollination. And they need to, like, there's the one that drops the this, and then that becomes the fertilizer for the that, beans and corn and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, that's a thing. So it's sort of that ecosystem idea that's really important, and why most trees don't just grow sort of by themselves out in the middle of nowhere. They're like alongside other trees, and they drop pine cones, and new trees grow up, and pine cones and stuff like that. So I like that, because it kind of goes, oh yeah, right. Like, all of those things are, I can see why those are all important, and like why that's a better picture than the battery picture. Like, who does what in the battery picture? I guess God charges up the battery. All of life is the running down of the battery. We're the battery. I don't know. Maybe someone's driving the car. They're the other person. But, so you get my idea. Like, all three things of these important. That's what I want you to think about. What are those four things? And I guess really the question for us is, so this is where, you know, if we were in a workshop, I would make you sit and do this with a piece of paper. But I do want you to think about this, because finally, we're going to talk about ourselves. You know, kind of the question, obviously, is what does an everyday spirituality look like for you or for me? So we ask these questions. What do I know about me? What do you know about you? I mean, do you kind of know what your spirituality is like? Do you know what you like, what you don't like, what you find helpful, what gives you life? When do you feel most connected to God? And however you picture God. What does your reality right now lend itself to? So like, what are the limitations in your life and what are the opportunities? I should print this out. I'm gonna print this out and give it to you as a handout. And then that last one that I mentioned, who might I connect with? This one's a little more difficult sometimes. And I've just put these questions on the board, but is any one of those that someone's like, I've got to, as I hear that question, I realize I mean, these are questions I would give you on a retreat and give you a piece of paper and tell you to go spend a little bit of time thinking about it. So if you want, I will do that. I had a person who was actually at Courtney's house who I was talking about this workshop. This is before I did it the first time. Kind of this whole idea of thinking about these questions, who was just like, just tell me what to do. Like, I don't want your dumb questions and ideas. Just tell me what to do. There's a funny side story to that, but I think that's fine. That's a legitimate question. But I want to say to us, I was like, okay, but it's not just what things should I do, but it's what kinds of things should I do? Like, that's kind of what this temperaments thing is about. Like, I could tell you 25 ways to go pray tomorrow, but unless you know what's a good way for you to pray, you're just trying a bunch of stuff. Now, maybe trying stuff is a way to find it. I understand, but and I think it's important to know ourselves and our situations, and then hold what we do in our spiritual lives fluidly. So maybe you're one who likes to read every day as part of your spiritual engagement, but you've got 10 doctor's appointments this week. Maybe you don't get to read this week, or maybe you take the book with you to the doctor's appointment, or whatever the thing is. But you have to know, and you can't say, but I only read, at 10 a.m. sitting in this chair. Well, then you're going to be in trouble when you have 10 doctor's appointments in the week. And I think it's important to start with the big questions first. Otherwise, we just do a lot of trying things and being frustrated and feeling like we're broken or wrong or something like that. So asking, as you think about your spirituality and your situation, then what, right? So that's okay, cool. So I guess if I sort of figure out what makes me come alive with God, what do I do? And once I realize what my week looks like, what do I do? How do I connect with others? Where? Doing what? Who are these others? What spiritual practices? I don't even, what are those things? I've only heard of like 3. Is there more? I don't really know. How do I pray? Is that a thing? Those are good questions. In a way, those are like another workshop. That's really a horrible thing to say at the end. But that's where, as I've said, I think throughout this, I can't answer that for every single person here. Like, each person here has to answer those questions for themselves. There can be help with that. Like, I think we can be helpful to each other in saying, you find yourself, you think you're have more contemplative spirituality. Oh, well, maybe how have you tried this? Or here's something that I like to do. Or, oh, you find yourself connecting with God while you're out in the garden. Well, let me tell you this idea. So I think partly it's knowing those things, and then it's talking with other people. I mean, there's people like me or Audrey or others who are like, oh, well, let's sit and talk about that, because I've got, maybe there's some ideas for you if you want ideas. I think the other thing is you can ask those questions of others. So you could say to somebody else, you know, when I pray, I don't find that praying through a list is really helpful. And they might say, well, I do. Or they might say, I don't either. Or they might say, oh, I stopped doing that, but I do this. Like, I think there's you know, we have again the get outside of our like, oh no, there's something wrong with me, to actually talk with someone else. I think it'd be really fun. I know I've talked about this before with Marky. Like, I think it'd be really fun to have like a small group that like kind of talks about this together and then tries stuff. You know, like, oh, you're like this. What about this? You know, and so you kind of create like a little experience group and help encourage people to try it on their own during the week. And maybe we talk about ideas together. So if you're interested in that, let me know, because that's something I've been wanting to do for a long time. But I think if you ask these questions, what is my spirituality like? What is my reality like? How can I connect with other people? We can have a good conversation, like a really fun conversation together, which I would love to do. So hopefully this is something that you're like, okay, like I can ask those questions. I will print this out in a way. So if you didn't write it down, take a picture if you want to. You don't have to report back. Or how can I use this with others? You know, how do we do this as a family? Or how do I do this with a friend or whatever, whoever you're with? I guess I'm just going to say these. Well, I've got a last words. Any questions, having said a bazillion things? Yeah. Any questions about the principles that I've laid out so far? But I cannot answer for you personally and individually from the front. I know that's what everybody's question is. Yes, Dolores. Well, that's good. That's really good. Ah, yeah. Yeah. That's very good. I think partially that's where the doing it along with others is really helpful, because so I'll give you an example. So maybe the best example. I mean, it's like on a Sunday morning. You know, there's a certain way that we have a worship service, which may or may not be your preference. Like we might not do the kind of music that you like. We may or may not pray the way that you like. I know this. I'm as one who plans worship. But I think what we've decided together is we're all going to come and be part of this experience. And some parts of it aren't going to be what I love, and some parts of this I actually dislike. But we do it together because I know that you love that part. So I think that's part of it. I think that's a really helpful part. This idea that it's not just us dreaming up something and making a plan and doing it. I think the other part is kind of the looking at where God is and what's God at work at in the week. And sometimes it's saying, how can I experience God in this thing? So I'm not setting out to do this thing, but as I'm doing this thing, where is God? I think it's always a great question. Where is God here? Where is God at work? That's a really good question. Yes, Janice. I'll repeat your question. Yes, sorry. Mm. Mm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. So Janice is kind of talking about this idea that many of us have this experience of this is the way you do it. And it's very prescriptive, which may or may not work for us. And sometimes we find our own way, and sometimes we don't find our own way. And particularly, how do we help people as they're beginning? So children, for example, but probably others. I had a friend who always says, I really stuck with me. So it must, well, I don't know if it's true, but it stuck with me. Which is, what is it? You have to try a way before you find your way. And so I think there is something about that in education, right? That like, well, if you don't know what to do, at least try this. And then from this, you will learn, not that for me, or this works for me. I think the problem, how many school teachers here? The problem with school is it's always like, this is the way and there's no other variants. And so do this. And if you don't, you failed. It's changing, and it's changed in some contexts where it's like, okay, well, we have to teach you the basics, but from the basics now, and Janice is an artist. So I would imagine that there are some techniques in art that you learn. And then once you've got the technique, then you can create. But it's important to know whatever those techniques are. And I think probably I would say something similar. I think what the problem is most of us beat ourselves up because we always think, but that's the way. And everyone else does it the way. And I've been taught that is the way. And it takes a lot of our lives to go, but I don't get up in the morning, for example, or I don't like to read that way, or whatever the thing is. So I want to free us from that. I think there are some good things to try out. I think that's the fun part is, well, how do I know if I'm more of an ascetic spirituality if I've never tried any, whatever those are? I don't even know what that means. So I think some of it is learning and exposure to those kinds of things. And I love the idea of exposing people to different kinds of practices. And I love the ideas of godly play, which isn't so much do this and learn this, but it's like, what do you think of this, right? I mean, that's my interpretation of I wonder. Here's the thing, I wonder. Like that, to me, helps foster this kind of spirituality. So I'm really glad that we're doing that. I think we do that in different ways for our adults, but I think that's a really valuable thing. So I think that's right. I think that's a good question. So I'm going to, if there's other questions, you can ask me afterwards, because I want to close so that we can carry on with other things. With my big grand finale of this, which is an everyday spirituality like we want will not come from outside of ourselves, nor will it come from doing more of the same. It comes from fresh eyes on God and our unique spirituality and our reality. Creatively engaging the possibilities that exist where they meet, where those three things, God, myself, and our reality meet, and trying it with others. So yes, this approach is more loose than a four-step model of some sort, but I think it's also infinitely more powerful and full of possibilities for you, for our congregation, for those outside of the church. This is like one of my great hopes. When we talk about spirituality like this, there's a lot more people who are like, okay, I want to hear about that. It's liberating to find that you can connect with God in a way that fits you. That's liberating. And most people haven't always been there. And it's empowering to learn that God can meet us in our situation. So these perspectives. The last things that I always say pretty much in every workshop about spirituality is, to me, connectedness to Jesus is the key. So you can do stuff, but it's the vine and the branches, it's the tree, it's the lake, all of those examples. I guess that's why I say God's kind of a critical piece of this equation. So practices alone don't give life. They position us to receive life. That's what I think. So those practices are super important. They're really helpful, but they're kind of like you said, Dolores, like that's us getting on the train. Like I got to do the something, but the something is the train, right? And I hope that as we think about these things, and I mean, of course, I want to talk more about all these with you all, but that this kind of everyday spirituality will lead us to this more abundant life, this full to the brim kind of life that we're talking about right now. It doesn't negate kind of the reality around us. I think it empowers us to live connected to God in the midst of all of the realities that we find ourselves in. So I'll conclude with that, but I'm glad to answer any other questions and talk with anybody pretty much all the time about this stuff. So yeah, I hope you have other questions and I'll answer those. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.